summer of 2000, and the unforgiving Mexican sun beat down on the dusty streets of Real Decados like a punishment from ancient gods. The small town nestled high in the Sierra Madre Mountains had been transformed into a film set for a quirky romantic comedy called The Mexican. And somewhere between the crumbling colonial buildings and the endless desert horizon, Hollywood's biggest female star was about to have her entire world turned upside down. Julia Roberts stood in the shade of a makeshift tent, her famous auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her megawatt smile nowhere to be seen. At 32 years old, she was the highest-paid actress in the world, a woman who could command $20 million per picture, a force of nature who had conquered every challenge the industry had thrown at her. But on this particular afternoon, with the temperature climbing past 100 degrees and the production falling behind schedule, Julia Roberts looked like what she actually was beneath all the magazine covers and red carpet glamour, a woman who was desperately, achingly lonely. Her co-star Brad Pitt was somewhere across the set, running through his lines with the director Gore Verbinski. And the crew moved around her in that choreographed chaos that defined every film production. Camera operators, lighting technicians, sound engineers, makeup artists, dozens of people whose names she would never remember, all working to capture her image for audiences around the globe. And then she saw him. He was adjusting a camera rig near the edge of the set, his sun-bleached hair falling across his forehead, his tanned arms moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Daniel Moder was 31 years old, a cinematographer who had worked his way up through the ranks of Hollywood's technical crews, a man who spent his days behind the camera rather than in front of it. He wasn't looking at Julia Roberts the way everyone else did, with that mixture of awe and calculation that she had grown so tired of seeing. He was simply doing his job, completely unaware that America's sweetheart was watching him with an intensity that surprised even herself. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that would eventually destroy a marriage, ignite a tabloid firestorm, and create one of Hollywood's most enduring love stories. If you want to discover how this forbidden connection on a Mexican film set transformed into a love story that defied every prediction, survived every scandal, and proved that sometimes the heart knows things the mind cannot explain, stay until the end. You won't regret it. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand what Julia Roberts had already survived in the arena of love. Her romantic history read like a cautionary tale about the impossibility of finding genuine connection in the fishbowl of fame. There was Kiefer Sutherland, the intense young actor she had been engaged to marry in 1991, until she called off the wedding just 3 days before the ceremony and fled to Ireland with his best friend Jason Patric. The tabloids had crucified her. Runaway bride, they called her, years before she would star in a film with that exact title. Then came Lyle Lovett, the country singer with the unconventional looks and the poet's soul, whom she married after knowing him for just 21 days. That union had lasted barely 2 years before dissolving quietly, leaving behind more questions than answers. By the time she arrived in Mexico to film The Mexican, Julia Roberts had been publicly linked to Matthew Perry, had weathered endless speculation about her personal life, and had built walls around her heart that seemed impenetrable. She was tired of being analyzed, tired of being judged, tired of opening herself up only to be disappointed. Her smile still dazzled on command. Her laugh still filled rooms with its infectious warmth. But behind those famous brown eyes, there was a guardedness that hadn't been there when she was young. But here's what nobody tells you about walls. They don't just keep pain out, they keep everything out, including the unexpected moments that can change your entire life. Daniel Moder wasn't supposed to matter. He was a crew member, a technician, someone who existed in that invisible army of professionals who made movies possible without ever appearing on screen. He was also, inconveniently, a married man. His wife, Vera Steinberg, was a makeup artist, a woman he had been with for several years, and by all outward appearances, their marriage was solid. But appearances in Hollywood are about as reliable as promises made at 3 a.m. Julia noticed him again the next day, and the day after that. She found herself looking for him on set, tracking his movements with awareness that felt dangerous and exciting, and completely unlike her usually cautious approach to romance. There was something about the way he carried himself, confident but not arrogant, focused but not cold, that drew her in despite every warning signal her brain was sending. The first real conversation happened during a break in filming, when Julia wandered over to where Daniel was checking camera equipment. She asked him something mundane about the lens he was using, a question she had no genuine interest in, and he answered without the fawning nervousness that usually characterized people's interactions with her. He treated her like a colleague, like a regular person, like someone worth talking to, for reasons beyond her fame and her fortune, and her face. It was the most refreshing thing that had happened to her in years. What started as casual conversations evolved into something deeper over the following weeks. They talked about their childhoods, Julia's complicated relationship with her family in Georgia, Daniel's more stable upbringing in Los Angeles. They talked about their work, their dreams, their disappointments. Daniel made her laugh, not the performative laugh she deployed at industry events, but the real one, the one that came from somewhere deep in her belly and left her gasping for breath. And Julia found herself telling him things she had never told anyone, peeling back the layers of protection she had spent years constructing. The problem, of course, was Vera. Daniel's wife was not a distant abstraction, but a real woman with real feelings, and Julia knew she knew that what she was feeling was wrong. The Catholic guilt from her Georgia upbringing whispered warnings in her ear. The memories of her own heartbreaks reminded her how it felt to be betrayed. She tried to pull back, to create distance, to convince herself that this was just an on-set infatuation that would fade once production wrapped. But every time she saw him, every time he smiled at her with that crooked grin that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets, she felt her resolve crumbling. "This isn't who I am," she told herself one night, alone in her trailer, staring at her own reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was supposed to be America's sweetheart, the girl next door who had made it big, the role model for young women everywhere. That woman didn't fall for married men. That woman didn't wreck homes, but that woman was also exhausted from performing, from being perfect, from denying herself the one thing she had never been able to find, a love that felt real. The production wrapped, but the connection didn't end. Julia and Daniel found ways to stay in touch, their communication becoming more frequent and more intimate as the months passed. Meanwhile, Julia's career continued its meteoric trajectory. She was filming Erin Brockovich, the role that would finally win her the Academy Award she had been chasing since her first nomination for Steel Magnolias a decade earlier. She was on top of the world professionally, but her personal life was in chaos. In March of 2001, Julia Roberts stood on the stage of the Shrine Auditorium and accepted the Oscar for Best Actress. Her speech, a breathless, rambling declaration of gratitude that charmed audiences around the world. But what those audiences didn't know was that somewhere in the back of her mind, even during her greatest professional triumph, she was thinking about Daniel Moder. The situation became public in the ugliest possible way. Daniel separated from Vera in early 2001, and the tabloids immediately connected the dots. Julia Roberts' Homewrecker screamed the headlines. The woman who had built her career on being lovable was suddenly being cast as a villain. Vera Steinberg didn't go quietly. She wore T-shirts printed with slogans like "Aloe Vera," a play on a lover, posed for photographers, and made it clear that she blamed Julia for the destruction of her marriage. The media had a field day. Every outlet from serious newspapers to grocery store tabloids weighed in on Julia's moral character, questioning whether America's sweetheart deserved that title anymore. Julia faced a choice that would define the next phase of her life. She could retreat, end the relationship with Daniel, attempt to rebuild her squeaky clean image, or she could follow her heart, consequences be damned. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life managing her public persona, the decision should have been obvious. Instead, Julia Roberts chose love. It wasn't an easy choice, and she didn't make it lightly. There were long nights of doubt, conversations with her mother, Betty Lou, sessions with a therapist who helped her untangle the guilt and the desire and the fear. But underneath all the turmoil, Julia kept coming back to one undeniable truth. Daniel Moder made her feel like herself. Not Julia Roberts, the movie star. Not Julia Roberts, the tabloid fixture. Not Julia Roberts, the $20 million woman. Just Julia, just the girl from Smyrna, Georgia, who loved to laugh and hated pretense, and wanted nothing more than to be genuinely known by another human. Being Dot, the divorce between Daniel and Vera was finalized in May of 2002. Julia had weathered nearly 2 years of public criticism, her reputation taking hits that would have destroyed lesser careers. But she had also discovered something valuable about herself. She was stronger than she had ever known. The famous smile that had launched 1,000 magazine covers had always hidden a core of steel. But now that steel had been tested and proven, she had chosen her own happiness over public approval, and she had survived. July 4th, 2002. Independence Day, on a ranch in New Mexico. Far from the paparazzi and the critics and the endless noise of Hollywood, Julia Roberts married to Daniel Moder in a ceremony witnessed by only a handful of close friends and family members. She wore a cotton dress. He wore jeans. There were no studio executives calculating the publicity value, no stylists obsessing over every detail, no publicists managing the message. There was just a man and a woman, choosing each other, promising to build a life together. When photographs eventually emerged, the world saw something unexpected. Julia Roberts looked happier than she had ever looked on any red carpet, at any premiere, during any interview. This wasn't the megawatt performance smile that had made her famous. This was something real. The years that followed proved what the cynics thought impossible. In a town where marriages often last shorter than film productions, Julia and Daniel built something enduring. They had 3 children together, twins Hazel and Phineas in 2004. And son Henry in 2007. Julia stepped back from the relentless pace of her earlier career, choosing projects more selectively, prioritizing presence over fame. She had spent decades being America's sweetheart. Now she was focused on being a wife and mother. Daniel continued his work behind the camera, eventually becoming a respected cinematographer in his own right. His credits, including the critically acclaimed Secret, In Their Eyes, and several of Julia's own projects. They collaborated professionally without competing, supported each other's careers without sacrificing their family, created a partnership that defied every Hollywood stereotype. More than 20 years later, Julia Roberts and Daniel Moder remain married a feat so rare in their industry that it practically qualifies as a miracle. When asked about the secret to their longevity, Julia typically deflects with humor, that famous laugh filling whatever room she's in. But in quieter moments, in interviews where she lets her guard down, she reveals a truth that sounds almost too simple to be real. She chose a partner who sees her completely and loves what he sees. The scandal that once threatened to derail her career has long since faded into Hollywood history, replaced by the image of a woman who found her way to genuine happiness through unconventional means. The t-shirts and the tabloid headlines and the moral judgments, all of it, proved temporary. What proved permanent was the connection that sparked on a dusty film set in Mexico. When a lonely movie star and an unassuming cameraman looked at each other and recognized something neither of them had expected to find. Julia Roberts has said in interviews that meeting Daniel taught her to trust her own instincts. Even when the world was telling her she was wrong, she had spent so much of her life seeking approval from audiences, from critics, from an industry that judged women more harshly than men, that she had almost forgotten how to listen to her own heart. Daniel gave her permission to remember. And perhaps that's the real legacy of this love story. Not the scandal, not the drama, not the tabloid headlines that seemed so important at the time. The legacy is simpler and more profound. Sometimes the greatest risk you can take is allowing yourself to be truly known by another person. Sometimes the path to happiness requires you to disappoint people who don't actually have your best interests at heart. Sometimes America's sweetheart has to stop being sweet and start being real. Today, when you see Julia Roberts at rare public appearances, that megawatt smile still lights up the room. But there's something different about it now in depth, a contentment, a peace that wasn't there during her wildest years of fame. She found what she was looking for. Not in another Oscar or another record-breaking payday, but in a partnership that has weathered 2 decades of challenges and emerged stronger than ever. Behind the cameras and the headlines, beyond the reach of critics and commentators, Julia Roberts built the life she always wanted. And it all started with a look across a Mexican film set. When the most famous woman in the world saw a man who didn't care about her fame and realized that was exactly what she had been searching for all along, if this story inspired you, if it reminded you that love is worth fighting for, even when the world doesn't approve, then please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more untold Hollywood stories. Share it with someone who needs to hear that following your heart is never the wrong choice. And leave a comment below telling us, what would you risk for true love? We read every single comment, and your story might inspire our next video. Thank you for watching until the end. You're part of our family now.